When NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal moves into Oak Ridge Heights, he's met with silent resistance and one woman's unshakable hatred. But when a terrible accident leaves his biggest critic fighting for her life, Shaq makes a choice that no one sees coming. What happens when the man you resent becomes the one who saves you? In a town divided by fear and prejudice, can one act of courage change everything? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The morning sun stretched over Oak Ridge Heights, a neighborhood that prided itself on its polished lawns and quiet streets. At first glance, it was the picture of harmony, but beneath the surface, old biases and unspoken tensions lingered. Standing out in this community was Shaquille O'Neal, or as most knew him, Big Shaq, a towering figure with an even bigger heart. Despite his wealth and fame, he had chosen to settle in this seemingly ordinary suburb, hoping to foster change through kindness and action. Shaq's home was a sprawling yet welcoming estate at the end of Maplewood Drive. Unlike other high-profile residents who walled themselves off, he kept his gates open, often seen outside shooting hoops with local kids or chatting with neighbors. To many, he was a pillar of generosity, always helping where he could, donating to local businesses, organizing community basketball events, and supporting struggling families. But not everyone saw him that way. Across the street lived Eleanor Caldwell, an elderly widow whose stern glare rarely softened. To her, Shaq's presence felt out of place. Though she never openly voiced it, her microaggressions, her refusal to wave, the way she clutched her purse tighter when he passed, spoke volumes. This used to be a quiet neighborhood, Eleanor would often mutter under her breath. She wasn't alone in her skepticism. A small but vocal group of homeowners, led by Caldwell Harrington, a well-dressed businessman with a carefully curated image, viewed Shaq as a disruption. Caldwell had deep ties in the community and an air of authority that made people listen. He never outright opposed Shaq, but always found ways to remind others that Oak Ridge Heights was a place of tradition. Shaq, however, remained unfazed. He had faced prejudice before. This was nothing new. He focused instead on his mission, building bridges where walls had been placed. One of his closest confidants in the neighborhood was Marcus Carter, a retired ex-NBA player and longtime friend. Unlike Shaq, Marcus wasn't as patient with the community's cold shoulders. "Man, I don't get it," Marcus grumbled one evening as they shot hoops in Shaq's driveway. "You do more for this place than anyone else, and some of these folks still act like you don't belong." Shaq caught the ball effortlessly, chuckling. "Hate doesn't need a reason, Marcus. But kindness doesn't need one either." Marcus sighed. "Yeah, but I wish you'd stop letting them walk all over you." Shaq shook his head. "Nah, man, I'm not letting anything happen. I'm just showing them who I really am. People fear what they don't understand. My job is to make sure they do." One person who had started to understand was Maya Brooks, an investigative journalist new to the neighborhood. Unlike most, she didn't dismiss Shaq's impact. She saw it as a story worth telling. Maya had grown up in a city where community was often a last priority, so seeing a man of Shaq's stature investing in everyday lives intrigued her. She watched as he bought groceries for struggling families without seeking recognition, how he took time to talk to the teenagers everyone else ignored. She saw the subtle tension, the whispered conversations behind his back, the way Caldwell always found a way to undermine his contributions. Determined, she decided she would write about the man behind the fame, showing his real impact. But she knew it wouldn't be easy, especially with people like Eleanor and Caldwell watching his every move. One morning, as Shaq returned from handing out food at the community center, Eleanor stood at the edge of her yard, pretending to trim her roses. Her eyes narrowed. "Another charity stunt?" she asked coldly. Shaq stopped, meeting her gaze with a calm smile. "Just helping out." Eleanor scoffed. "People around here help themselves." Shaq studied her for a moment. He could see the bitterness etched in her face, but beneath it, there was something else. Something deeper than just resentment. "Maybe not everyone can," he replied gently before walking away. As he disappeared into his house, Eleanor exhaled sharply. She didn't know why his words lingered, but they did. Meanwhile, Caldwell sat in his sleek office downtown, staring at a newspaper that featured Shaq helping out at a local school. He drummed his fingers against his desk, irritated. Shaq was gaining too much goodwill in the community. If things continued this way, people might start questioning men like him, the ones who thrived on exclusivity and quiet control. Caldwell smirked to himself. "You can't change people, Shaq," he muttered, "and sooner or later, you'll see that." The stage was set. Shaq was winning hearts, but enemies lurked in the shadows. And though he had spent a lifetime proving himself, Oak Ridge Heights was about to test him in ways he never expected. The crisp autumn air settled over Oak Ridge Heights as life in the neighborhood carried on as usual. But beneath the quiet hum of routine, something was shifting. Eleanor Caldwell's resentment toward Shaquille O'Neal had begun to fester, spreading through her interactions like an unspoken storm. She wouldn't say it outright. She never did. Instead, her words were carefully chosen, laced with subtle barbs that only the intended target could fully decipher. It started small. One morning, as Shaq walked past her yard on his way to the community center, she made sure to be outside, pruning the same rosebush she tended every day. "Funny how some people think charity makes them part of a community," she mused, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. Shaq slowed, offering her a polite nod. "Good morning, Eleanor." She barely glanced at him. "It used to be." Shaq exhaled through his nose, keeping his cool. He had dealt with people like Eleanor before, those who masked their prejudice behind nostalgia, clinging to an era that never truly existed. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to live, to give, to be a part of something bigger than himself. And if that made certain people uncomfortable, well, that wasn't his problem. But Eleanor wasn't done. At a neighborhood gathering the following weekend, she turned to Victoria West, a young attorney who had just moved in, and said, "I miss when this place had a little more refinement." "Before all these changes," Victoria frowned. "What changes?" Eleanor took a sip of her lemonade, her eyes flickering toward Shaq, who was surrounded by a group of kids, laughing as he spun a basketball on his fingertip. "Well, just look around. It's different now. Not everyone understands what it means to live in a neighborhood like this." Victoria was sharp. She understood exactly what Eleanor was implying. "You mean people who actually care about their neighbors?" she countered. Eleanor's lips pursed. "I mean people who don't turn everything into a spectacle." Shaq, as always, remained gracious, even when the microaggressions piled up. When he greeted Eleanor with a friendly wave, she would respond with a tight-lipped smile. When he offered to help carry her groceries, she insisted she could manage, then allowed someone else to assist her minutes later. When he sponsored the new youth basketball program, she scoffed, muttering to another neighbor, "Turning our streets into a playground now, are we?" Marcus, however, wasn't as forgiving. One evening, as they sat in Shaq's backyard, Marcus shook his head, tossing a basketball between his hands. "Man, I don't get you," he said, his frustration clear. "You let that woman disrespect you every day, and you just smile through it. How do you do that?" Shaq stretched out in his chair, watching the sky darken. "She's not my problem, Marcus. She's her own problem." Marcus scoffed. "That's a nice thought, but people like her? They don't change. They just wait until they get enough people on their side before they do something worse." Shaq turned to his friend, the flicker of a smile playing on his lips. "You think I don't know that? I've been dealing with this since I was a kid. But I also know one thing for sure. Hatred is heavy, and carrying it only weighs you down. That's why I don't pick it up." Marcus sighed, shaking his head. "I admire your patience, man. But I don't trust her." Neither did Maya. She had been watching Eleanor carefully, taking mental notes. There was something about the older woman's bitterness that didn't quite add up. It wasn't just casual prejudice. It was personal. But why? Her instincts told her there was a story here, something buried beneath Eleanor's carefully composed demeanor. People weren't born with this kind of resentment. It came from somewhere. Maya just had to figure out where. Meanwhile, Eleanor's frustration reached new heights when Shaq organized a charity basketball event for the neighborhood. Families showed up in droves. Kids ran excitedly across the makeshift courts, and even some of the more reserved residents found themselves caught up in the energy. But Eleanor? She sat on her porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like it was an invasion. Caldwell Harrington, the ever-observant businessman, took a seat beside her. "Seems like quite the event," he remarked. Eleanor huffed. "This isn't a circus, it's a neighborhood." Caldwell smirked. "And yet, some people seem determined to change that." She glanced at him, sensing something in his tone. "You don't approve either?" Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's just say, I like things the way they were." For the first time, Eleanor felt like someone understood. That night, as the echoes of laughter and bouncing basketballs faded, Eleanor stood by her window, staring at Shaq's house. She wanted to believe she was right, that he didn't belong, that he was forcing something unnatural onto their community. But deep down, another thought gnawed at her. What if she was the one who no longer fit in? The resentment twisted inside her, and as she turned away from the window, she made a decision. If Shaquille O'Neal thought he could change Oak Ridge Heights, she would make sure he learned otherwise. The sun hung high over Oak Ridge Heights, casting long shadows on the perfectly manicured lawns. The air was still, but beneath the surface, an unspoken tension had been building for weeks. Shaquille O'Neal had learned to ignore it, brushing off the glances, the murmurs, the polite yet clipped greetings from those who wished he weren't there. But Eleanor Caldwell had never been the type to bite her tongue for long. It started that afternoon in the quiet way most storms do, slow and brewing. Shaq was outside, loading crates of bottled water into his truck for the community center's weekly drive. A group of neighborhood kids sat on the curb watching him, their laughter bouncing off the pavement as he playfully tossed a basketball between them. Eleanor stood by her mailbox, her lips pressed together in a thin, disapproving line. She had tolerated this long enough. The noise, the attention, the way people, her people, seemed to gravitate toward him as if he belonged. Finally, she snapped. "You're too much, you know that?" Her voice cut through the air, sharp enough to silence the kids mid-laugh. Shaq paused, resting an arm on the truck bed before turning to her. "Afternoon, Eleanor." She folded her arms. "This neighborhood was peaceful before you came along. Now it's like a... She hesitated, searching for the right words, the acceptable words. Shaq tilted his head. "Like a what?" She inhaled sharply. "Like a spectacle. You're always out here, always making yourself the center of attention, hosting events, handing out charity like it's your job to save people." She shook her head. "It's too much." Shaq let out a slow breath, his patience stretching thin. "I'm just trying to help, Eleanor. That's all." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You think I don't see what this is? A show. A performance." She glanced at the kids, then at the neighbors who had started to take notice. The confrontation was drawing an audience. You do all this to make yourself look good, to make people forget what you really are. Shaq's jaw tightened. "And what exactly is that?" Eleanor hesitated, but her silence said more than words ever could. Marcus, who had been walking up the driveway, froze mid-step. His hands clenched into fists, but Shaq lifted a hand, stopping him before he could speak. This wasn't a fight worth having in anger. Shaq took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "You don't know me, Eleanor. You don't know anything about me. But you've already decided what kind of man I am." He nodded toward the kids. "Do you think they see me the way you do? As some kind of outsider who doesn't belong?" Eleanor's gaze flickered, uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes on her. "They don't know any better." Shaq let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean they haven't learned to think like you yet?" The street was quiet now, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Then, from the sidelines, Caldwell Harrington stepped forward, his presence as calculated as ever. Unlike Eleanor, he didn't act on impulse. He observed, waited, and chose his moments carefully. "I think what Eleanor is trying to say," Caldwell interjected smoothly, "is that some of us value tradition, stability, the way things have always been." His eyes locked onto Shaq's, cool and assessing. "Not everyone here is comfortable with change." Shaq met his gaze without flinching. "Change happens whether you're comfortable with it or not." Caldwell's smirk was barely there. Spoken like someone who enjoys disruption. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "You know what I enjoy? Seeing kids with a safe place to go. helping people who need it, being part of a real community, not just a collection of houses with people afraid to step outside their own doors. Maya, standing a few feet away with her ever-present notebook, watched with interest. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood squabble. This was the kind of tension that exposed people's true selves. Eleanor's frustration boiled over. You act like you're some kind of savior, like you're fixing something that was never broken. Shaq took a deep breath. You ever ask yourself why it bothers you so much? Why it gets under your skin to see someone else trying to make things better? Eleanor's mouth opened, but no words came out. Caldwell, sensing her uncertainty, smoothly redirected. This isn't about better or worse, Shaq. It's about fit. Not everyone belongs everywhere. Shaq let those words settle in the air before replying. People don't belong in places. They belong with people. He looked around, meeting the eyes of the neighbors who had gathered. Some looked away. Some nodded. Some, like Victoria and Marcus, stood unwaveringly at his side. Eleanor's fingers curled around her sweater, her face flushing with emotion. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not in front of her peers. This isn't over, she muttered before turning on her heel and storming inside her house, slamming the door behind her. Caldwell watched her go, then turned back to Shaq, offering a slow, knowing smile. You've certainly made an impression. Shaq didn't return the smile. So have you. Caldwell's smirk deepened, but he said nothing else. He simply gave a polite nod and walked away, disappearing down the street. The onlookers slowly drifted apart, murmuring among themselves. Some exchanged glances, as if reevaluating their own thoughts on the matter. Others shook their heads, whispering disapproval. But a few, just a few, watched Shaq with something close to admiration. Maya clicked her pen and slid her notebook into her bag. She had seen enough for today. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. You handled that better than I would have. It's not about handling it, Shaq murmured. It's about not letting it handle me. Marcus sighed. You think she's gonna back off? Shaq glanced at Eleanor's house, where the curtains had twitched shut. No, he admitted. But that's not my battle to fight. That's hers. The tension in Oak Ridge Heights did not dissipate after the confrontation. Instead, it settled over the community like an unshakable fog. Conversations that once flowed easily between neighbors were now punctuated by hesitant glances and quiet whispers. Lines were being drawn, though few were bold enough to admit it outright. Some residents sided with Eleanor, not because they were openly prejudiced, but because they found comfort in the past, in the way things had always been. They didn't appreciate the shift Shaq had brought to the neighborhood, even if they couldn't pinpoint exactly why it unsettled them. They claimed it was about preserving tradition, protecting the character of the community, ensuring things didn't get out of control. But beneath their carefully chosen words, the sentiment was clear. Others, however, admired Shaq. They saw his generosity, his patience, his unwavering commitment to making the neighborhood better. Victoria West, a sharp and ambitious attorney, was one of them. She had moved to Oak Ridge Heights for the peace and quiet, but the events of the past few weeks had shaken her perception of what this neighborhood truly represented. At a local coffee shop, Victoria overheard two women, longtime residents, talking in hushed tones. It's just too much change all at once, one of them murmured. We moved here for a certain kind of environment. Exactly, the other agreed. He's a public figure, for God's sake. He attracts attention. And those people who show up for his charity events? I don't feel safe anymore. Victoria set down her cup with a little more force than necessary. She turned to them, offering a tight-lipped smile. I have to ask, she said, her voice measured. Which part exactly makes you feel unsafe? The food donations? The kids playing basketball? Or is it just Shaq himself? The women stiffened. That's not what we meant, one said quickly. No, of course not, Victoria replied smoothly. But words are funny, aren't they? They have a way of revealing what people really mean. The conversation ended there. But Victoria knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. Shaq, for his part, refused to let the negativity break him. He continued his work, organizing charity events, mentoring kids, and helping struggling families. But he felt it. The eyes. The weight of being constantly watched. the way some neighbors hesitated before responding to his greetings, their smiles tighter than before. One evening, as he locked up the community center, Marcus leaned against the hood of his car, arms crossed. "You're gonna burn yourself out, man." Shaq sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Can't stop now, not over this." "It's not about stopping. It's about knowing when to breathe." Marcus studied him. "Be real with me, Shaq. This getting to you?" Shaq hesitated, then admitted, "More than I want it to." Marcus nodded. "I don't blame you." He let out a long breath. "But you gotta be careful. People like Eleanor, they don't just back down. And Caldwell? He's watching, waiting. You're disrupting his little kingdom." Shaq already knew that. Caldwell hadn't confronted him again, but Shaq could feel his presence, a quiet storm forming in the background. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks had been busy. She didn't believe people like Eleanor simply woke up one day filled with resentment. There was always a story beneath the surface, and she was determined to find it. Maya spent hours at the local library, combing through newspaper archives and property records. She interviewed longtime residents, asking careful questions about Eleanor's past. What she found wasn't surprising, but it was revealing. Decades ago, Oak Ridge Heights had been an all-white community, a place where exclusivity was its own silent rule. That had changed over time, slowly, as new families moved in, as the world outside evolved. But some people like Eleanor, had never truly adapted. Maya dug deeper. She found an old news article. Eleanor's son, Andrew Caldwell, had died nearly 30 years ago in a racially charged altercation. There were few details, just vague mentions of a fight gone wrong, of an argument that spiraled into tragedy. The man accused had been a young black teenager, barely 18. Suddenly, Eleanor's resentment made more sense. It wasn't just about Shaq. It was about something she had never healed from, something that had left her bitter and angry. But did that justify her actions? Maya wasn't sure. The whispers in the neighborhood continued. Some residents urged Eleanor to let it go. Others nodded in quiet agreement with her. And then there were those who were undecided, caught between old fears and new realities. One evening, as Shaq walked his usual route around the neighborhood, he noticed something different. Some doors stayed closed. Some windows had their curtains drawn. The message was clear. A choice was being made. And soon, something was going to break. The night was heavy, pressing down on Oak Ridge Heights like a weighted silence. It was the kind of night where secrets felt closer, where memories long buried threatened to surface. Maya Brooks sat in her dimly lit home office, surrounded by scattered documents, old newspaper clippings, and scribbled notes. The air was thick with unease as she read the same article for the 10th time, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Local youth killed in late-night altercation. Suspect released after self-defense claim. Andrew Caldwell, Eleanor's son. Maya exhaled, leaning back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She had uncovered plenty in her career, but this felt different. This wasn't just a story about a bitter old woman clinging to outdated prejudices. This was a story about loss, about a wound that had never healed. She glanced at the second article, printed weeks later. Charges dropped against 18-year-old in connection with local teen's death. No details, just a vague statement about conflicting witness testimonies. No names, no real closure. The kind of case that quietly disappeared, lost in the cracks of time. Maya had seen this pattern before. A black teenager walks away free, but not truly. His name forever whispered in hushed conversations. A white mother loses her son, and in her eyes, justice is never served. The community absorbs the tension, lets it settle, never quite resolving it. Eleanor wasn't just angry at Shaq. She was angry at history, at fate, at a world that had taken her son and given her no one to blame. But knowing that, truly knowing that, made things harder, not easier. Maya tapped her pen against the desk, staring at the old black and white photo of a young Eleanor, smiling beside a boy who couldn't have been older than 16. A boy who never made it to adulthood. Was this the reason Eleanor couldn't accept Shaq's presence? Was this why every act of kindness felt like an insult? Why she clung so tightly to the past? Maya didn't know what to do with this information. Did the truth even matter if the damage had already been done? Meanwhile, across the street, Eleanor sat alone in her darkened living room, a glass of whiskey untouched beside her. The old newspaper clippings were still in the drawer, where she had kept them for decades, hidden beneath useless bills and long-forgotten letters. She didn't need to read them to remember. Andrew. Her boy. Her hands trembled as she reached for the framed photo on the table. The same one Maya had found in the archives, only in color, his blonde hair bright under the summer sun, his smile unburdened. He had been everything to her. And then, in an instant, he was gone. She could still hear the crack of that night. Not a gunshot, not a scream, a scuffle, a struggle, a fall. A story told in missing seconds. The boy who had killed him had been let go. A name she refused to say. A decision she had never forgiven. And now, there was Shaq. Another giant of a man, towering over her neighborhood, taking up space, taking up attention, taking up the air. He was kind, generous, larger than life, and it enraged her, because her son was dead. And here was Shaquille O'Neal, living a life her boy would never have. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him. But the longer she stared at that picture, the more the hate tangled with something else. Something she couldn't name. Maya spent the next day wrestling with her thoughts. She ran into Shaq outside the community center, where he was unloading boxes of supplies. He looked tired, but still greeted her with a warm nod. "You good, Maya?" She hesitated. "Yeah, just working through something." Shaq studied her for a moment, then leaned against the truck. "You ever figure something out and wish you hadn't?" Maya let out a dry laugh. "Every damn day." Shaq smiled, but there was an understanding in his eyes. Maya almost told him. She almost said it right there, under the bright afternoon sun. But something stopped her. Would knowing change anything? Would it make Shaq's life easier or harder? Would it soften Eleanor or push her further into her anger? Maya wasn't sure. For now, she kept the truth to herself. But she knew the storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Oak Ridge Heights, the air crisp with the promise of an early winter. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Neighbors were out walking their dogs, kids were riding bikes, and the distant hum of lawnmowers filled the air. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Eleanor Caldwell had never been a reckless driver. She had been making the same turn onto Maplewood Drive for years, her hands steady on the wheel, her speed always controlled. But today, something felt off. As she pressed the brake near the intersection, nothing happened. Her heart lurched. She pressed harder. Still, nothing. The car wasn't stopping. A sharp panic clawed at her chest. The houses, the sidewalks, the parked cars. They all blurred as the vehicle barreled forward uncontrollably. She yanked the wheel, but the tires screeched in protest. Her breath came in short gasps as she saw the curve ahead. A dangerous bend that dropped off into a ditch. And then, in a single terrifying second, it happened. The car hit the curb at an angle, launching it sideways. Eleanor barely had time to register the violent impact before she felt herself being tossed like a rag doll. The vehicle rolled once, then again, before coming to a shuddering stop against a streetlight. Smoke curled from the hood. Flames flickered to life beneath the crushed engine. The neighborhood stood frozen. No one moved. No one screamed. The horror of it all had gripped them in silent shock. Then, before anyone could react, Shaq was running. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. His body just moved, pure instinct taking over. Marcus's voice rang out behind him. "Shaq, wait!" But Shaq didn't stop. The car was smoking heavily now, the front end crumpled like paper, metal groaning under the weight of its own wreckage. The flames spread, licking at the edges of the hood, threatening to engulf the entire vehicle. And inside, trapped between the twisted seatbelt and the crushed dashboard, Eleanor lay motionless. Shaq reached the car just as a small explosion burst from the front grille, sending a wave of heat over his skin. He ducked back, coughing through the thick smoke. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" A faint sound came from inside. A weak cough. She was still alive. Shaq grabbed the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The metal had warped from the impact. He stepped back, then threw all his weight against the door. Nothing. Again. Nothing. His pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't have time for this. Pivoting to the shattered window, he reached inside, ignoring the sharp edges of glass biting into his skin. Eleanor's frail form was slumped against the seat, her eyes fluttering open. Shaq. Her voice was barely there, more a breath than a word. I got you. Stay with me. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and suffocating. Eleanor coughed violently, her body too weak to fight. Shaq yanked at the seatbelt, but it was jammed. His fingers fumbled against the clasp, his mind racing. The flames were spreading fast now. He couldn't let this happen. Not like this. With one final, desperate pull, the belt snapped free. Shaq reached around her, careful but quick, and pulled her toward the window. She was lighter than he had imagined, frail, breakable. Lifting her as gently as possible, he maneuvered her through the shattered window and into his arms. Behind them, the fire roared. The heat seared against his back as he moved, fast, urgent, away from the wreckage. Then, as if on cue, the car let out a deafening boom. A fireball erupted behind them, sending a shockwave through the street. People screamed. Windows rattled. But Shaq kept moving. He didn't stop until he was far enough away, until he was sure the danger had passed. Then, finally, he sank to his knees, Eleanor still in his arms. The paramedics arrived minutes later, but to Shaq, time had become meaningless. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. Her breaths were shallow, but she was alive. A strange silence fell over them. Her gaze met his, and for the first time in all the months he had known her, there was no resentment in her eyes. No bitterness, no fight left. Only something vulnerable, something fragile. Then, just before her consciousness slipped away, she whispered something. Shaq leaned in, barely catching the words before her body went limp. I was wrong about you. And then she was gone, not dead, but unconscious, cradled in the arms of the very man she had spent so long resenting. The neighborhood, once divided, now stood together, staring, speechless. Because in that moment, they all knew. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't just saved Eleanor. He had saved them from themselves. The scent of burnt metal and smoke still lingered in the air the next morning. The wreckage of Eleanor's car had been cleared, but the weight of what had happened remained, hanging over Oak Ridge Heights like a thick morning fog. No one could stop talking about it. How close she had come to death. How, of all people, Shaquille O'Neal had been the one to save her. Eleanor woke up in a sterile hospital room, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the first sound to reach her ears. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could hurt. There was a tightness in her chest, not just from the accident, but from the realization that she was still here. She blinked at the ceiling, her mind hazy, until a memory surfaced. The fire, the glass, Shaq's arms around her. A shiver ran through her, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. A guilt that sat heavy in her chest. For years she had convinced herself that men like him weren't to be trusted. That no matter how much they smiled, how much they gave, it was all a front. But Shaq had risked everything for her, and that truth was unbearable. Back in the neighborhood, the ripples of the event were everywhere. At the local diner, two elderly women, longtime friends of Eleanor, sat in their usual booth. One stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, while the other sighed. You think she'll be different now? The first woman hesitated. People don't change overnight. No, but near-death experiences have a way of making you rethink things. Neither had an answer. Across town, at a small park where families often gathered, Victoria West leaned against a bench, watching a group of parents chatting. Their conversation had shifted from PTA meetings and property values to something else entirely. A conversation they had avoided for years. Maybe we were wrong about him, one father admitted. I don't know why I ever saw him as a problem. Because it was easier than looking at ourselves, Victoria muttered under her breath. People were beginning to ask themselves the hard questions. Why had they been so resistant to Shaq? Why had they let themselves believe Eleanor's bitterness without question? And most importantly, what else had they been wrong about? While the community reflected, Caldwell Harrington saw an opportunity. He sat in his sleek office, watching the headlines scroll across his screen. Basketball legend saves neighbor from fiery crash. Shaquille O'Neal, a hero in Oak Ridge Heights. Caldwell leaned back, smirking. This was gold. The story had spread beyond the neighborhood, picked up by local news stations, debated on morning talk shows. For once, the nation wasn't discussing Shaq's career or business ventures. They were talking about his humanity. And Caldwell? He saw an opening, a PR moment. If Shaq was seen as the unifying force of Oak Ridge Heights, Caldwell needed to align himself with that. Publicly supporting Shaq, even if he didn't mean it, could be beneficial. He picked up his phone, making a call. Set up a meeting with O'Neal. I want to discuss a community partnership. A smirk crossed his lips. If you couldn't control the narrative, you could always rewrite it. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Eleanor did something she never imagined she would. She asked to see Shaq. The nurse hesitated before passing along the message. When Shaq got the call, he wasn't sure what to expect. Part of him thought she might still be bitter, still hold on to whatever anger had fueled her for so long. But when he stepped into her room, something was different. Eleanor looked small in the hospital bed. She had always carried herself with rigid pride. But now, she just looked tired. She turned her head toward him. Their eyes met. For the first time, she didn't look at him like an enemy. A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. Why did you save me? Shaq let out a slow breath, stepping closer. Because it was the right thing to do. She looked away, her fingers gripping the thin blanket. I wouldn't have done the same for you. Shaq didn't flinch. I know. Her throat tightened. That's the problem. For the first time in her life, Eleanor was forced to confront herself, and it terrified her. The hospital room felt colder than it should have. The machines beeped softly, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and outside, the city moved on, unaware of the battle being fought inside Eleanor Caldwell's mind. She had never been a woman of weakness. Not in her youth, not in marriage, not in motherhood, and certainly not in grief. But now, as she lay in the sterile quiet, her body bruised, her hands trembling slightly against the thin blanket, she felt it creeping in. Weakness, or something close to it. And Shaquille O'Neal stood at the edge of her bed, arms crossed, silent. He had saved her. That fact sat in her chest like a stone, an unshakable weight pressing against years of resentment, years of justifying the way she felt. But now, all she felt was tired. Her throat was dry when she finally spoke. Do you think people like me can change? Shaq exhaled, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. I think people change when they want to, when they're ready to see things for what they are. She scoffed. And you think I'm ready? A beat of silence. Then Shaq shrugged. I don't know, but you asked the question, so maybe that's a start. Eleanor turned her face toward the window. The sun was setting, casting warm streaks of orange and pink across the skyline. She wished she could go back in time, before the accident, before Shaq moved in, before she had let herself become the bitter old woman that people whispered about. But time only moved forward. She took a shaky breath. I lost my son. Shaq. The words came out quieter than she intended, fragile in a way that made her grip the sheets beneath her fingers. She had never said it out loud like that before. Shaq remained still, waiting. Eleanor's voice cracked. He died in a fight, and the boy who killed him got to walk away. She swallowed hard. I spent years telling myself it wasn't about race, that it was just bad luck, that justice failed because the world is unfair. But deep down, I knew. She finally turned to face Shaq again, her eyes shining with something raw. If my son had been the one to survive, he wouldn't have walked free. The truth sat between them, heavy and real. Shaq's face softened, but he said nothing. Eleanor let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. I let that anger fester. I let it become me. And when you moved in, you were everything I had trained myself to resent. Everything I thought had taken my son away from me. Her fingers curled into fists. But you saved my life, and I don't know what to do with that. The silence stretched long and unbroken until Shaq finally spoke. "You could start by forgiving yourself." Eleanor's breath hitched. Shaq continued, his voice even, steady. "You've spent so much time blaming the world that you never let yourself grieve. You just turned that pain into something else, something easier to carry. Hate's lighter than grief, isn't it?" She didn't answer, but the tears in her eyes spoke volumes. Shaq leaned in slightly, resting a hand on the edge of the hospital bed. "You don't have to like me, Eleanor. You don't have to pretend this is some perfect redemption story. But if you really want to change, stop seeing me as a symbol for everything you lost. Just see me as a man who wants to help." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. Shaq nodded slowly. "Neither do I. But maybe we can figure it out." For the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that might be possible. The news of Eleanor's recovery spread quickly through Oak Ridge Heights. Some people were relieved, others weren't sure how to feel. And then there was Caldwell Harrington. Sitting in his office, he scrolled through the news articles about Shaq, the accident, the way the neighborhood was shifting. It made him sick. For years, Caldwell had positioned himself as a silent force in Oak Ridge Heights, maintaining the exclusivity of the neighborhood, making sure the right kind of people moved in and the wrong ones stayed out. He never said it outright. No, that would be bad for his reputation. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, pulling strings, whispering the right things into the right ears. But Shaq? Shaq had ruined everything. And now, people were starting to see him as a leader. An opportunity presented itself, one that Caldwell knew he had to take before it was too late. The next evening, Caldwell called for a community discussion at the neighborhood clubhouse. People arrived cautiously, some curious, some skeptical. Caldwell stood at the front of the room, his usual charisma dialed up to full effect. "First, let me just say that what happened to Eleanor was a tragedy, and we are all grateful for her recovery," he began smoothly. "And of course grateful to Mr. O'Neal for his bravery." Shaq, sitting in the back, kept his face unreadable. Caldwell continued. "That being said, I think it's important we ask ourselves some hard questions. Is this neighborhood still the place we all wanted it to be? Are we still protecting the values that made Oak Ridge Heights what it is?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Shaq clenched his jaw. He had heard this rhetoric before. Caldwell's smile widened as he saw heads nodding. "Now I propose we take some steps to ensure we maintain the integrity of our community. Perhaps some new policies, guidelines to keep our traditions alive." Victoria West stood abruptly. "Policies? Guidelines?" Her voice cut through the room like a knife. "Why don't you just say what you mean, Caldwell?" Caldwell's expression barely faltered. "I don't know what you mean." Victoria crossed her arms. "You're not protecting this neighborhood. You're trying to control it. You're using vague language to make people afraid of change, to make them think we need you to keep things safe. But the truth is, the only thing you're trying to protect is your own influence." The room fell into stunned silence. Caldwell opened his mouth, but Victoria wasn't finished. "You know what, Caldwell? We don't need you. This community has already changed, and for the better." She glanced at Shaq. "We don't need someone telling us how to protect it. We need someone willing to actually be part of it." Applause broke out, slow at first, then building into something undeniable. Caldwell's face turned rigid. He had lost, and he knew it. A week later, Eleanor returned home. Her steps were slower than they used to be, but her heart felt different. She stood on her porch, watching as Shaq played basketball with the neighborhood kids. She still didn't understand how he could be so open, so willing to give, even after everything. After a long moment, she finally took a step forward. Clearing her throat, she called out, "O'Neal." Shaq turned, pausing mid-shot. "Yeah?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded toward the ball. "Pass it here." A small smile played at the corner of Shaq's lips as he tossed her the ball. Eleanor caught it, her hands unsteady, but she held on. The kids watched, confused. Then Eleanor, with slow, deliberate movements, dribbled once, twice, a deep breath. And then, for the first time in a very long time, she played. The neighborhood watched in quiet awe, because change had come to Oak Ridge Heights, and it had come to Eleanor Caldwell too. 9. Conclusion. The power of change. The sky above Oak Ridge Heights was a deep shade of blue, the kind that only arrived after a storm had passed. The air carried a quiet hum, a feeling of something settled, yet stirring. It had been 2 weeks since Eleanor Caldwell had returned home. 2 weeks since the accident, since she had uttered words she never thought she'd say, since she had allowed herself to see the world differently. And now, standing on the steps of the Oak Ridge Heights Community Hall, she was about to do something even harder. She was about to face them all. The hall was packed. Residents filled every seat, murmurs of anticipation spreading through the crowd. This wasn't just another neighborhood meeting. This was something else. Something unprecedented. Shaquille O'Neal stood near the back, arms crossed, listening. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. At the front, Eleanor adjusted the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't let it show. She cleared her throat. I never thought I'd be standing here like this. The murmurs quieted. For a long time, I saw the world a certain way, and I told myself that I was right. She swallowed. But sometimes we hold on to things not because they're true, but because they're all we have left. A heavy silence settled over the room. Eleanor's grip tightened on the podium. I've spent years believing that change was something to be feared, that people like me had to protect what we had, or we'd lose everything. She hesitated, then turned her gaze toward Shaq. But I was wrong. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor exhaled slowly. I was wrong about a lot of things. I was wrong about Shaquille O'Neal. I was wrong about what makes a community strong. And I was wrong to believe that helping others means taking something away from yourself. A shift, a murmur. People weren't sure what to do with this moment, but Eleanor wasn't done. 2 weeks ago, I almost died. And the man I spent months resenting was the one who saved me. Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to ask if I deserved it. He just acted. Because that's who he is. She took a breath. And if I can admit that I was wrong, then maybe, just maybe, we can all start looking at things a little differently. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single clap. Then another. Then the room erupted. The applause wasn't loud, wasn't wild. It was steady. Earnest. It was the sound of something changing, of something being let go. And Shaq? He just nodded. The next morning, Maya's article hit the news. The man who refused to let hate win. It spread fast, faster than even she had expected. Within hours, social media was ablaze with Shaq's story. Not about basketball, not about fame, but about character. About how, in a world that often divided, he had chosen to unite. Networks picked it up. Radio stations discussed it. People across the country debated it. Some called it a redemption story. Some called it a reminder. And Eleanor? She didn't care what people called it. She just knew it mattered. Shaq remained the same, unshaken, humble. He still showed up at the community center. He still mentored kids, still helped families, still chose kindness, even when the world didn't make it easy. One evening, as he walked home, he noticed Eleanor sitting on her porch. She wasn't watching him, not in the way she used to. She was just sitting, looking out at the neighborhood. She caught his eye, and for the first time offered a nod. No words, just understanding. Shaq nodded back. The seasons changed. People still whispered. Some people still held on to their old ways. But something was different. There were more greetings on the street, more invitations, more moments of connection that hadn't been there before. And at a small park on a cool autumn day, Eleanor Caldwell sat on a bench, watching a group of children playing basketball. She didn't call it noise anymore. She just watched. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled. Because real change takes time. But it's always possible. Change isn't about grand gestures. It's about the choices we make every day. Who we welcome, who we listen to, and who we stand beside when it matters most. What would you have done in Shaq's place, or Eleanor's? Every community has a story. maybe it's time to rethink yours. Because sometimes, the biggest transformations start with a single moment of courage.